Hi, is that phone insurance? Yeah. Yeah, well, basically what it was, I asked my friend to throw my phone up in the air because I'm doing an effect for YouTube. And he was supposed to catch it, but he dropped it and now the screen's smashed. What's going on, guys? My name is Bruce. Welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to show you how I made this. You know, this is not a tutorial, this is a breakdown. I'm actually going to break down this whole effect for you so you can see exactly how I made this effect. The applications I used to make this was Adobe After Effects and a plugin from Video Copilot called Element 3D. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, Element 3D is not a free plugin. However, it is very powerful and I cannot recommend it enough if you want to get into 3D. That said, it's not a full 3D program, so there are some limitations to it. However, the integration within After Effects is absolutely seamless. Hold on. I need to change the music. That's better. Now, before I jump into the computer, I want to talk about planning and preparation. If you don't plan for these sorts of videos, you're not going to get the effect that you want. It is so important to plan, and I'll show you the reason why in a second. But first of all, I'm going to show you how I actually plan for mine. If I can get my phone. Okay, I got my phone. Now, I plan everything in my notes on my phone. This is the easiest way to plan your shots. Have it in your phone, put it in your notes, give it a title. You can search back your notes if you need to. It's so handy to have. There are other applications out there you can use dedicated just to do this. I like using notes in phone. Now, I'm going to read this off exactly as I've written it in my phone so you can see how I plan this. So, shot of Rob with phone to ear, over the shoulder shot, then dropping down to text position. So that means he's going to have his phone to his ear, and then he's going to drop it down like he's texting. So he's looking down and he's texting. So this is shot one essentially. So shot one, like that, just so you know. Side walking gimbal shot of Rob, dropping phone down from ear to text position, then throwing phone in the air. Emphasize on the drop before flicking the phone up. So this is going to be him bringing it down, and then he's going to do an emphasis of just like he's going to throw the phone up in the air. So it's going to be like an emphasized, you know what I mean? Also try this at 4K if possible as well. Basically, what I'm saying is do it with 4K, is try and use 4K because you've got more to zoom in on. The thing is, when I writ this, I didn't realize that my camera that I'm shooting on now, which is the A6500, doesn't shoot high frame rates at 4K. The maximum it does is 30 with a crop. So for me, it wasn't going to be possible to use that. I wanted to use 120 frames a second. The A6500 does that, but its maximum resolution at that frame rate is 1080p. One of the important things about this effect is you have a background that's quite plain. The sky is really handy to use because it's such a plain background and you can zoom in and there's not much distortion, especially with 1080p footage. You're going to be zooming in and you're going to be losing a lot of that resolution. So to have a nice plain background really makes it so much easier. And it also, which is another thing I'll go on to when I get into the computer, it also means that when you come to edit it, you haven't got to do a lot of masking because it's quite plain and quite simple, which means when you go to remove the real phone, and you'll understand this when I get to it, there's less masking to do. I mean, as you can see, the wall behind me is quite plain. If I was to throw my phone into the air, it would be easier to mask because there's not a lot going on in the background. Going further on down, track element phone to background in AE for transitions. I mean, the English ain't great, but what I'm trying to say in that is I need to track the phone into the footage. Something really important to have is a reference when you want to put a 3D model into a scene. Getting something like a phone throwing up in the air is really hard to get the motion look realistic. If you've got a real phone in the scene that you can actually track to, or you can mimic the rotation of, believe it or not, he actually cracked my phone when he threw it. It makes it so much easier, especially when you're using a plugin like Element 3D that doesn't have things like fluid dynamics or wind simulations or rigid bodies, like a full 3D program would. And also it gives you something as a point of reference to get the lighting and the shading right on the 3D model. Okay, so let's jump into the computer and let me show you how I made this effect. Okay then guys, welcome to the wonderful world of After Effects. So this is the effect that we're going to be breaking down today. Okay, I think the best way to show you this would be to start from the bottom and work my way up really. So I'll turn all these layers off. We'll start with this one. Now, as you can see, this is actually a pre-composition. So I'll double click that and open this one up. And essentially, this is the base of our effect really. This is the foundation. This is just Rob throwing the phone up in the air. Nothing too spectacular. It's nice, smooth, slow motion, as you can see. And the reason for that is because if I go into the project window up here, the project panel, and find this footage, you'll see the frame rate is set to 23.976. I shot this in 120 frames a second, and I've conformed it to 23.976. The way I've done that is I've right-clicked, I've clicked interpret footage, click main, it'll be set to this, but I want to change it to this, 23.976, because my composition is 23.976. My timeline in Premiere Pro is also 23.976. So if you take footage that was shot at 60 or 120 or 240 or whatever, and you convert it to playback at this speed, then you're going to get slow motion, and you're going to get very nice smooth slow motion as well, which is what I wanted for this effect. Okay, so moving on from this, the only reason why it's in a pre-composition is because I've added warp stabilizer. And as I come out of this, you'll see that's just warp stabilizer on and off. There's a little crop because it cropped in. There wasn't an awful lot of stabilizing it needed to do. I just wanted it to make sure it was nice and smooth. Coming out of this, what you'll notice is this layer has some time remapping keyframes. So you can't put time remapping on a warp stabilized clip. So that's why it's in its own pre-composition. These keyframes really is just slightly sped up there, and then the hand flick, and then this one to this one is nothing changed. It's just the slow motion. All right, that is why it's in a pre-composition. That is the only reason. Something else you'll notice is it gets blurry. I've also added a camera lens blur. I think the radius starts at 0 and goes up to about 10. All right, you'll know why in a second, but that is that layer, and that is the foundation of the effect. Now, the layer up from that is this one. As you can see, this is simply a mask for the layer above, and this is just a copy of this. So I've duplicated this layer, put it above. I've slightly offset the layer. So if you go to the transform, you'll see the position has been moved slightly. If I solo this layer actually and turn off the mask, you'll see the layer's been moved over to the left slightly, and that is because what I've actually done is I've added a mask here and then moved the layer over slightly. So when you overlay these two layers, you're using the mask of this section here of the clip above, and then moved it over like so. You wouldn't need to do this. When I made this video about a year ago or so, there wasn't something called content aware fill, which is this here. Had this been around back then, I would have used that. I use this all the time now. It's really good to use. Had this been there, I would have definitely used this. So you don't need to do this. This is just the old school way to mask. It does a really good job. It does do a really good job, to be honest. There is a slight change in the clouds there, but you don't really notice that because you'll know in a minute, the blur and the zoom in, it sort of hides it. So yeah, had that been around back then, I would definitely have used that. And had I made this effect now, I would be using this and not this way around. The only other things really with this layer is to mention is the fact that there is a camera lens blur on it as well, which is exact copy of the layer below. So this layer and this layer, camera lens blur on here and camera lens blur on there, because they are both supposed to be the same layer essentially. All right. Something else you'll notice with these layers is the fact that they have motion blur turned on, and they are 3D layers as well. That's very important for when we get onto the layer above, which takes me very nicely to the throw camera, which I have named it. Now, the throw camera is a 3D camera, which will affect any layer that has the 3D tag on, or is a 3D element like the iPhone. It uses the lights. So I've used these layers, made these layers 3D and added motion blur. Now, you'll notice when I switch this on, it moves, and that's because there's some keyframes on this camera and also position that I've moved around. So as now I go past this keyframe, you'll see it seems as though the layer is scaling, but it's not. What's actually happening is there's a virtual camera that's zooming in instead. So the reason I've done it this way and not scaled the layers is because firstly there's two layers, and I didn't want to have to scale them. And secondly, when I put the iPhone in a moment, you'll notice that because I'm zooming in and this is a 3D element, had I not used a 3D camera, the phone would not get bigger as I got closer. So the keyframes I've used on this layer, really simple. Just position keyframes. So it's gone up to the right, and it's also done some zooming in as well. All right. Had I moved this one around, you would see it zooming out like so. And that is all this layer does. The way I did this is I actually used the C key on the keyboard, and you can toggle between these 4 different options. Really handy to use. So if we use this one, we can move. We're not actually moving the layer, we're moving the virtual camera. And if I was to use this one, it's the zoom. We zoom. Right, let me just pause for a second. What's actually happening is the camera's moving forwards and backwards. The camera's not technically zooming in. There's a separate control for that. For some bizarre reason, I kept saying the camera's zooming in, but I thought I'd just clear that one up before somebody starts attacking me in the comments. Now. And if I was to use this one, then we can do some really trippy stuff like rotating around the scene that starts to give you some weird perspectives like this. All right, so let's come out of that because we don't want that. And that essentially is what that layer is. Take those keyframes off so we're not getting ourselves confused. There we go. Okay, moving on up then. I didn't discuss the depth of field. There is a slight depth of field keyframe as well. This isn't essential, but I will come back to that in a moment. I added some depth of field to the camera just to give the phone a bit of blur, but it's not that essential in this scene. It would be normally. I do it in a lot of my other videos, but in this one it wasn't that important. Okay, so now we're getting on to the actual fun stuff, the iPhone. So let me switch this one on and you'll see there we now have a lovely iPhone. This is a 3D model that I purchased from TurboSquid, and the way I applied it to the layer is, first of all, I created a solid. So I'd right click, new solid, and then on that solid I would come, say this is the new solid, I would go to Effect, Video Copilot, and click Element. That would then bring up this, which is the element layer effect, and this is essentially just an effect for that solid. But this is the very powerful plugin that allows you to add 3D elements into your After Effects project, but it also creates a scene for you as well. So if I click this is going to open a whole new window that you can then basically set up the scene. I'm not going to give you a tutorial on how to use Element 3D. I'm just going to give you a quick breakdown of the 3D model I've used and how I got it into the scene. So this 3D model I purchased from a website called TurboSquid, and this is a website that sells 3D models that 3D artists have made, and they've uploaded them to this website and people can buy them, download them and use them, and the rights to use them within their projects. I think I might have used one like this here, which was optimized for Element 3D. The only thing you need to worry about really with these objects really is the file formats. You want to be looking for one called E3D or OBJ if you're going to be using them inside of Element. There are also other file types like 3ds Max, Maya, Blend. Those ones are dedicated just to those applications. E3D again is just going to be able to be opened in Element 3D, but OBJ can be opened in different applications. It's like an interchangeable format really, OBJ, FBX. So really the OBJ ones are the ones you want to be looking for, or E3D if they've got them. So the way I actually got this phone looking the way it is I didn't actually do too much to lighting. If I click this button here, you can see the environment, and this essentially is like a HDRI for the environment, for the lighting and the reflections on the phone. I didn't need to upload my own or use a different one. However, I could have if I wanted to. To do that, I would go to environment, I would come down here, I would load from file, I would go to my environments or HDRIs. Let's just load in this one. And then now you can see the reflections and the lighting have changed because they're using the reflections and lighting of this HDRI instead. If I click OK on that, you'll see that now it's colored for this scene, and it fits in this scene a lot much better. I didn't need to do that for mine. However, you can take your own HDRIs if you wanted to. It's just like a 360 photo. There are actually apps out there you can download, free apps as well. I think Google Maps app is one of them. There is a dedicated app just for that. People can take their own 360 photos and upload them to Google, but you can also actually save them yourself as well, and put them onto your into your projects and use them for environments really. So that's the lighting setup I use. I just use a basic one. I didn't actually use one like this. I didn't need to. The phone itself is separated into two separate sections, iPhone 10 and iPhone 10 glass. I'll go through that later on. But the only thing you need to worry about really is on the iPhone 10 is the screen, and the screen is obviously Rob. And the way I got Rob onto there is I went down to this section here, which is the color for this screen. So if I turn this off, you'll see the screen disappears. And this here is just a texture map for the screen, and it says custom layer 1 because I've loaded this from the composition itself, and I'll explain that in a moment. But this here is the video of Rob where he flicks his fingers and these glasses magically appear on his face. I've separated these two, and I will explain why later on, but that is essentially the phone. So I'll come out of this. Okay then guys, back inside of After Effects. Now I want to go over the keyframes I've used on this layer. Now the keyframes I've used are basically just keyframes that are moving this phone, rotating it, and the position it's going in as well. All of this was done manually by keyframes. And there's a few ways you can do that. You can actually go into the group, so group 1, and I can move it around with these keyframes. So I can adjust the position, I can adjust the scaling, the rotation is down here. But the way I did it was I actually did it via the world transform. Now, this is not going to be good if you had more than one object in your scene because it's going to move both of the objects. But because I just had the phone, this worked really well. I actually did have the phone and the glass in two separate groups. So the glass was on group 2 and the phone was on group 1. So if I didn't do it this way, then I would have had to do the keyframing for the glass and the phone on both of the groups, and it just gets very finicky having to mess around with more keyframes than you need to. So just using the world transform worked absolutely fine for this effect. The keyframes itself they look quite intense, to be honest, but there's actually not that much to it. You can see position, so it's just adjusting the position of the phone. You can see the rotation as well, and that's all there is to this. If I was to move one of these keyframes around, you will see the phone is rotating in a different way, and that is pretty much all there is to those keyframes. Now, the way I got the phone looking more realistic is by using the real phone as a reference. And what I mean by that is if I turn off the mask, you will see the original there. I've basically used this as a reference or a guide to make the fake phone look more realistic. You can see the rotation of the fake phone mimicking the real phone. I mean, the location's not exactly perfect, but it doesn't need to be. Because it doesn't matter too much. It's more the rotation that is the one to get tricky. And I think the reason why I didn't copy the position was because it actually went off screen, so I couldn't get the effect I wanted anyway. So I think that was the highest I was happy to go with. Yeah, if I went any higher, it would have cut the actual this fake phone off the screen as well, and I didn't want that. So I kept it a little bit lower. But you can see the rotation is basically just mimicking the real phone. And that is all these keyframes are. I can't teach you these keyframes because it's going to be different depending on your scene and where the camera was and your subject and the velocity. But that is how I got this phone looking more realistic, shall I say. And then as you can see, about there is where it finishes mimicking. And then you can see now I've just brought the phone round so it looks as though it's centralizing the camera. This part isn't very realistic, but I mean, you're smashing through an iPhone screen, aren't you? I mean, what more do you want? Okay, moving on up then. There's not really much more to that layer. That is basically all there is to that one. Next one is a light. So we have a light. This wasn't actually that essential. If you're using a HDRI, you don't really need to use a light, dependent on the HDRI that you're using. I think this added a very slight glow to it. I'm not entirely sure whether I needed to use that or not. I think it was just something I added in as a precaution, really. You don't have to add one of these. Like I said, if you're using an HDRI, it's not going to be essential. Sometimes you might want to give it a bit more ambient light, or just boost the colors slightly depending on your scene. And that is the light. The next one up from that is the Rob iPhone Texture Rotated. Now, this is essentially this. All right, so if this layer switched off, and this layer is actually switched off for the effect. If I switch this layer on, you can see Rob's pretty face. Now, I don't actually have to have this layer on. It needs to be switched off, because if it's on, then this layer is going to be on through the whole effect. And as good looking as Rob is, I can't really have his face on there the whole time. It's not going to give the effect that I want. But the reason why this is here is because this is the texture for this. All right. So the way I actually got him in the phone is if you come down to your phone, okay, which is the Element 3D, and then come down to where it says, just close these down, custom layers, you have an option here for custom texture maps. And I can actually load in a custom texture map into each of these slots. And I've chosen to load in Rob iPhone Texture Rotated, which is this. So if I click this and select Rob iPhone Texture Rotated, all I need to do then is when I go into my scene and I go into my iPhone 10 and select the screen, this, what I was talking about earlier, is this custom layer, which is there. If I had loaded one into number 2, then I can use that one in number 2. Now, the reason why I've rotated it is because this 3D model, when it was exported, has to have something called a UV map. And this here, this whole face, this object, was UV mapped in a way that when I put this photo on, it actually put him this way, put his left shoulder here, his right shoulder there, and he started looking really skinny. And it squashed the whole picture, and we obviously don't want that. So I could have taken this model, put it into a 3D program, unwrapped the UVs in a different way and re-exported the model, but to be honest, I mean, it was just too much work to do that. Wouldn't take taken too long, but a real simple fix for that would have been just to rotate this instead. So had this not been rotated, then what would happen is he would have been in this way instead, head here, left shoulder here, right shoulder here, and he would have looked really squished. Which is the reason why that is rotated. Now, this layer doesn't need to be switched on. It needs to be switched off, or put behind everything. Doesn't really matter. And that essentially is how Rob is in the phone. There are a few different options for sampling layer. You can use the source of the clip. You can use the masks, or you can use the effects and masks, which take into account any effects or masks that are on the clip. If you was just to use source, for instance, if I was to put a Lumetri color on this, and I selected source, then you wouldn't see the color effects of the layer. However, if I used a Lumetri color and I selected effects and masks, you would see the color on that effect, on that layer. In fact, I think I actually did use a Lumetri color. There we go. So there we go. If I was to turn that off and on, you can see it makes it slightly darker. So if we come into here and select source, you can see it's not using that Lumetri color anymore. But if I go onto effects and masks, it's now using the Lumetri color. So it's really handy to use if you want to use it as the source, or if you want to use the effects or the masks that are on the layer as well. And if you don't, then you just select source. Okay. The only other thing to worry about or to concern yourself with is these here. Now, this is going to be using the current time of that layer. So if I was to move this layer, you can see Rob's moving. All right. So it's using the actual time of this layer where the playhead is at that time. All right. As you can see, it's moving like that. If I was to go into first frame, it's going to use this first frame here, but it's going to be paused at that first frame. So he's never going to move. He's just going to stay completely still, and he's not going to do his little flick thing. And then if I selected random time, it just selects a random time. It does play, but it's just its own random time. All right. I obviously want it to be at current time because I want to use the time that I've set this layer to be at when it goes through the phone. So if I wanted him to have his arm a little bit further up when it goes through, then I would obviously move this layer a bit further along, like so. Okay. Other than that, the next layer above that is a glass breaking. This essentially is what it is. This is just some stock footage I got from a stock website that I've keyed out of an overlay. It's just some green screen of some glass breaking. There's really not much to that. I've actually used this before in quite a few of my other videos. I don't actually use it anymore, but back in the day when I was making these sorts of videos, I really enjoy putting these effects on. So there isn't actually any key on this because I've already keyed it out and exported it as an alpha anyway. So yeah, you would need to obviously get your own if you was to do that. Or you can use other effects within After Effects to get the same effect if you wanted to. And that is basically all that layer does. Other than that, the only other thing that you might notice is the fact that as the phone gets closer to the screen, you'll notice that it gets a bit brighter. And that is because I've adjusted the opacity of group 2. All right, so as the phone gets closer, you'll see it looks like the screen gets brighter. And if you watch this opacity setting, it will change. So from there, it goes 100 down to 50 at this one. And then from 50, it goes down to 0. I wanted to give the effect like the phone, the camera was smashing through the phone. And the problem I had was because the phone and the screen was all, and the glass on the screen was all one object, I couldn't animate the phone. I couldn't animate the fact that the camera was smashing through the phone. So what I actually did is I separated the phone and the screen into 2 separate layers. So as you can see up here, we've got the iPhone 10 and the iPhone 10 glass. Now this layer, or object shall I say, has everything switched off but the glass. And this object has everything switched on but the glass. Now, the reason I've done that is because this allows me to have this on layer 1 and this on layer 2. The option, the benefit of doing that means that when I come into my group settings, group 1 and group 2, I can adjust the opacity of this group separately to this group. So I don't need to adjust the opacity of this group because I'm just leaving the phone as it is. But I want the screen, or the glass, sorry, of the screen to disappear. However, if I was to drop the opacity of this one instead, then you'd see the phone disappear as it got closer. So if we get to, say, for instance here, if I was to drop the opacity of group 1, so if we go into the opacity settings of group 1 and drop them down, you can see the phone is disappearing. And we obviously don't want that. We don't want the phone disappearing. We just want the glass disappearing, which is why this is on a separate layer. So force opacity on group 2, and you can see it's like the glass is getting brighter, so the screen's getting brighter, and then this is when the glass green screen effect is happening. And essentially you don't need to do anything more with this clip now, because this is now the next part of, this is the next video. So you can use any video you want to be the texture. You don't have to use this one. This one. You don't have to use Rob's iPhone. You could use anything you wanted in there. And now this essentially is the next video. So the camera goes into the screen, and then it just carries on, and you can cut and do whatever effects or anything else you want to do with that. That basically is the whole effect. The only other thing on top of that I've added is a throw blur I've put on there, which is just an adjustment layer with a force motion blur on it. Let's turn that one back on. Yeah, there's not a lot to this really. What I wanted to do was add a little bit of extra blur. This is very heavy on the PC. It's very taxing. So I have actually switched this one off to show you the effect. But if I switch it on and off, you can see it does give a very, wait for it to load, it does give a very slight blur, as you can see there. If I switch that one off and on, it just gives it an extra bit of blur that I felt like it needed. Now there is just one other effect that I want to cover really, and that's the effect you've seen earlier. This is basically the camera lens blur. The reason this is on here is because it's actually mimicking depth of field for the background. So you're not really going to notice this because the background's quite plain, like I was saying earlier. And this really helps because there would have been a lot, you would have noticed the fact that the resolution has dropped quite significantly, but because it's such a plain background, your eye's not picking it up. This is actually blurred, and that's because of these keyframes here to here. So when it gets to here, this background is quite significantly blurred, but you don't see that because the camera is quite high in the sky as such, so that you don't see any info. There's no detail there because all the detail is down here. But now I've turned the camera off, you'll notice the fact that it's now sort of mimicking that depth of field look. As the phone comes close to the camera is actually switched off now. But as the phone comes closer to the screen, because I've used the position keyframes, there's this depth of field, or it's fake depth of field. It's not actually any depth of field being used from the camera for this. It's just a camera lens blur on this layer and on this layer, because obviously this one is a mask to this one, so they have to be completely the same. Now, like I was saying, this is not important for this scene, but had this phone been thrown up in, say, a city block where there was buildings behind, then this would be essential to get the realistic effect that you probably want to go for. And that, guys, essentially is the whole effect really. So when you've finished doing all of that, I'll leave that one off for now, you get and that's it, guys. The only other thing you'll probably notice is the fact that I've used motion blur. Motion blur was for the phone, and I've enabled motion blur for Rob throwing the phone. So from this position, if I was to turn motion blur off, you would see that it's not as smooth. Having the motion blur on just gives a nice sort of realistic effect, whereas when I had this off, it just didn't give it quite the effect I wanted to. I wanted to make it look like there was that real camera motion of it actually zooming into the 3D phone. Other than that, I have actually added some keyframes of depth of field. I felt like the phone, if you look at the phone from this position here, it was a little bit too sharp. So if I actually turn depth of field off, you can see it's just a little bit too sharp for my liking. I like to have it a little bit more blurry. So I put a bit of depth of field on there just to give the camera, the phone, a little bit more blur. It just looked a little bit too sharp for my liking, so I wanted to make it a bit more realistic. And I added some depth of field. And that essentially, guys, is the whole effect. There are some layers in here I've actually hidden because I don't want to get you too bogged down with the rest of the effects. But this is part of a sequence that starts off, goes into this scene and then goes into another scene. So if I actually unhide these layers, then there's a lot more going on here, which is going to be for a whole separate tutorial. So yeah, and that, guys, is essentially the effect. I hope you enjoyed that, guys. I hope you learned something as always. I'm going to do more breakdowns like this in the future. The video that this has come from is going to be in the description below, so go and see that video if you haven't already. Leave me a comment down below if you'd like to see something else broken down from that video, and if enough people ask for it, then I guess I'll make it. But thanks anyway, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.